All right, hello everyone. I've started looking at Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread, and I think we're going to get some fun out of that one. But I haven't quite managed to spend enough time on it to get something to make an episode out of it, so I thought I'd kind of give you guys kind of a fun little look at something that's been rolling around in my head for a couple of weeks, and hopefully I'll be able to do it justice. So, you saw the opening quote. We're looking at Mises on the topic of creative genius, and I'm going to bring this. I'm going to try to mesh Mises' thoughts on this particular topic with something that is a big hobby of mine. I play video games a lot, and we've seen a lot of video game producers in the last decade or decade and a half or so kind of turn from creating these amazing works of innovation, of this or that, fantastic writing, amazing art, beautiful music, into these kinds of like ridiculously preachy, nonsensical, awfully written, non-immersive pieces of slop. And I feel like we can get something from Mises about this phenomenon that we've been observing over the last 10 years or so by looking at this creative genius portion of human action. So let's start with the actual quote from Human Action. This is from chapter 7, and this is kind of the last section in chapter 7 of Human Action. Quote, "Far above the millions that come and pass away tower the pioneers, the men whose deeds and ideas cut out new paths for mankind. For the pioneering genius to create is the essence of life. To live means for him to create. The activities of these prodigious men cannot be fully subsumed under the praxeological concept of labor. They are not labor because they are for the genius not means, but ends in themselves. He lives in creating and inventing. For him there is no leisure, only intermissions of temporary sterility and frustration." That might be an exaggeration. "His incentive is not the desire to bring about a result, but the act of producing it. The accomplishment gratifies him neither immediately nor immediately. It does not gratify him immediately because his fellow men are at best unconcerned about it, more often even greet it with taunts, sneers, and persecution. Many a genius could have used his gifts to render his life agreeable and joyful. He did not even consider such a possibility, and chose the thorny path without hesitation. The genius wants to accomplish what he considers his mission, even if he knows that he moves toward his own disaster. Neither does the genius derive immediate gratification from his creative activities. Creating is for him agony and torment, a ceaseless, excruciating struggle against internal and external obstacles. It consumes and crushes him." So, how I'm going to take this quote from Mises' Human Action and relate it to video game production. Well, here's how I'm going to do it. First off, many old games were basically the product of creative genius. If we think about, I didn't want to name a million examples, but if we think about like Richard Garriott and Ultima, right? He created that on a shoestring budget, basically almost entirely by himself. He was innovating in the field of computer RPGs, right? We have Minecraft, which was basically a toy created by a guy who was like, oh yeah, here's a toy that you can play with, and you can just build whatever you want, and it became one of the most popular toys in the entire world. We have even things that actually had significant budget, like for instance, we think about Resident Evil. We have Shinji Mikami, right? He's the guy that created started out as kind of the director of Resident Evil. And he worked all the way from Resident Evil 1 through Resident Evil 4. And, they had varying levels of success, but they were all generally successes. Resident Evil 4 kind of revolutionized the survival horror genre by giving it a little bit more of an action flair. And then, in 2004, he split away from Capcom all of a sudden. He went off to work with Clover and Platinum Games. Resident Evil as a series, after 4, kind of devolved into repetition of Mikami's Resident Evil 4 formula in the hopes of recreating that lightning in a bottle that was Resident Evil 4. The thing is that as Capcom and Resident Evil were floundering, trying to produce the next hit Resident Evil, which they eventually did with Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Biohazard, as it's called here in the West, I think. Which is weird because Biohazard was the name of the series in Japan, before 7. So question mark. But they were trying to create something good, and over again, kind of failing, kind of rehashing things and making things not quite as good. And Mikami himself decided, basically went on to produce The Evil Within in 2014, which was heralded as kind of he captured the lightning in the bottle of Resident Evil 4 again in a different setting with a different type of story, with better action, better stealth, better this, better that. And so we see that at least part of the lightning in the bottle of the early Resident Evil games was Mikami's efforts as a creative genius. With Ultima, eventually Garrett, he kind of plays along as long as there's budget for him to make what he's trying to make. But eventually he kind of moves on and says, I've made enough out of this. I'm going to go do something else. In the case of Minecraft, this was created and then it was eventually bought out by one of the biggest corporations in the world. What's worth noting here is that the innovation of these game series is driven by the creative impulse. And there's actually something very special about that, because when the person in charge of the creative impulse is a creative genius, as Mises says, right? The creation itself is kind of its own end for him. And therefore, the creative genius is more willing than other creators, perhaps, to share the spoils of their creativity, right? So the company was able to produce this thing and pay him only a fraction of, in each of these cases, these companies were able to take these things and give them out to the masses and pay the creator only a small fraction of, what hand he had in actually creating it. So, what happens over time if these things are successful is that you get these larger budgets, you get you have to introduce holders of capital into the equation, because you can no longer create one of these games on the small budget that you can get from just kind of like what you can what you have on hand. You need to basically, as we see from the Misesian understanding of the division of labor, we get these capital holders. They basically put their funds in to the process of creating these things in hopes of getting a return on investment. However, what does this end up doing? What this ends up doing is it leads to putting non-creative geniuses into positions of leadership in these situations, right? We end up with, the people at Origin and later Electronic Arts who kind of are above, hierarchically above Richard Garriott and are kind of telling him, well, you got to do this and you got to have this budget. It's got to be done by this date, kind of thing. And there are cases where a person with good business sense can be useful in this situation. For instance, if you look at a series and you say, well, the two games back, we sold this many. The last game sold this many. This game, if we do this, we can expect it to sell perhaps this many or this much. And so that gives us an idea of what kind of budget we can afford for the creation of this next piece, right? This next game. Whereas the creative genius is just like, whatever you can give me, more would be better. But, okay, so this guy knows better, has a better idea of how much money we can expect to get in return for this. So, this helps to give me a more reasonable expectation for budget, as opposed to the creative genius who just wants to throw everything at this one particular project every single time. Right? This business sense has its uses in the mass production of things. As long as the geniuses are allowed to create, they kind of stick around. But eventually they either tire or they get forced out by commercial concerns. And here's where things go wrong, because now we have a company, a corporation, that is in the business of producing these works of innovation, games, and all of their geniuses. And of course, it's different from company to company, but in some of these cases, all of their geniuses have been driven off by their, either being too focused on, return on investment as opposed to the actual product, by making bad entrepreneurial decisions, by not by interfering with production, and even sometimes by letting the artist, the creator, get away with doing things that are going to be unappealing to people. That's also a thing too. But anyway, we now have a business. It's in the business of making games, and what it needs is new geniuses. Well, the problem is that these businessmen who are currently in charge of the business, they're good at entrepreneurship. They know how to figure out what the budget for the next project should be, what the time frame should be. That this franchise is more effective at bringing in new customers than this franchise and stuff like that. But what they're not necessarily good at is figuring out who the creative geniuses or potential creative geniuses are. And basically what they see these creative geniuses is like jerks, right? They're like, oh, I can't believe I have to deal with this son of a you-know-what every single day just because he's going to be creating just because he's the director of the next, entry in the such and such franchise. However, there are plenty of son of a you-know-whats who are not creative geniuses. And this is where the problem comes in, because the businessman cannot necessarily tell the difference between the creative genius and the person who's just an asshole. And so what happens is that the businessmen might hire a few prospective geniuses, but what they'll end up doing is hiring a much larger number, or at least a portion, of people who are not creative geniuses, but are just, insufferable purple-haired sociopaths. Now here's the problem with that, because once there's a place for insufferable purple-haired sociopaths to get jobs for producing practically nothing that can be measured, now there's a growth of a professional class of insufferable purple-haired, overconfident, untalented sociopaths. And as this class grows, they become a larger and larger fraction of the proto-geniuses that the businessmen hire. Basically, this asshole class pushes out legitimate geniuses because the businessmen can't tell the difference between one and the other. And in that sense, the next entry in this particular franchise is filled with the ideological concerns of the insufferable purple-haired sociopath, and none of the genius that is what made the game or its series or whatever popular in the first place. And then the business collapses. The geniuses are not harmed by this. They've gotten paid. They're willing to accept only a small fraction of what their genius produces, because for them, the production is where it counts. They go off to various other places and produce elsewhere if they're so inclined, or they just say, hey, I've got enough. I'm going to play around and, go fly in space, or, finish off the rest of my bucket list or something like some of these creators do. The thing about geniuses, too, is that geniuses aren't even particularly good at identifying each other, right? This is actually a really hard process. And so if it doesn't arise naturally from, a creative genius producing something and then, showing himself to be a creative genius, you're basically going to end up with this unproductive class taking the skins of geniuses, and hiding in them like wolves in sheep's clothing, or wolves in geniuses' clothing. Because think about it. We have cases, and these are just a couple that I looked up in the case of classical music, right? We have Brahms versus Liszt, where Brahms was kind of the old school composer and Liszt was the new school composer. Brahms falls asleep during one of Liszt's recitals, and Liszt calls Brahms hygienic but unexciting. These two people, who are both, by the average person recognized as, musical geniuses in some sense, don't recognize the genius in each other and end up bickering because they also happen to be assholes. We have Tchaikovsky versus Brahms. Brahms apparently didn't get along with a lot of people. Where Tchaikovsky is like, Brahms is a giftless bastard, a conceited mediocrity, and a very untalented person. We have Stravinsky and Prokofiev, where Prokofiev said there was no music in the opening to Stravinsky's Firebird. And they almost came to blows over one of Prokofiev's operas, where they basically said things to each other and almost got into a literal physical fistfight. We have, examples like this throughout the history of creative artistry. And what we're seeing here is when these creative works, say games, are produced for the masses, you end up with this business class that can't tell the difference between genuine creative genius and just a jerk. And so they end up hiring jerks. More jerks go in to get hired until the company collapses, and the geniuses have to go off somewhere else to ply their trade, basically. I don't know. I just thought this was a funny meld of old school Mises with new school, like modern, entertainment culture, and kind of helps to explain a lot of what we're seeing with these relatively long-running game franchises that just end up producing garbage eventually. It happens slowly because, as I said, right, the businessmen, some of the creative geniuses are willing to stick around, right? But this insufferable class basically grows and grows over time until they take over the business. Then they ram it into the ground because that's all they know how to do. Anyway, I thought that was a kind of a fun idea to do a video on. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. As always, Mises tells us everything we need to know about the world, and I am working on going through some Conquest of Bread. There's a ton of nonsense in that book that we are going to go through, and there's also some parts that we're going to have to look at, in a less hilarious sense and more actually seriously consider. For instance, Kropotkin says that we can have communism and anarchy, and that one leads to the other, and I think that we can pretty easily debunk that, among other things that he says. So, that's kind of the plan for next week. I'm going to try to put together a video on some of that Conquest of Bread book, making some fun. The first chapter is just worth making fun of, because it's so wrong in so many places. But we're going to go through it bit by bit, and we're going to find what's good in it, if anything, and poke fun at whatever isn't good. So hopefully you will enjoy that too. As for me, that is all I've got for you for today. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week for hopefully something interesting. Anyway, have a good day. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do, and I will see you all next time.